All right, guys. So we're doing our next social studies lesson. This one is actually a little easier than the last one. The timing is a little different. It's a little closer to right now. So we're asking ourselves, what does it mean to be free? Now, here's what we already know. We have a constitution, right? And it's alive. And there's three branches of governments, and there's Bill of Rights and our liberties. So let's quickly go over. We learned this the last time. We learned about the Constitution and branches of government, but let's go over it one more time. So, first of all, we have the Bill of Rights, and we know that the Constitution can be edited. And they made it that way so that no matter what, we can replace things that don't apply anymore, things that don't matter anymore, with things that do. Because it was written 200 years ago and life was really different 200 years ago. And they knew that our lives now would be different than theirs then. So they said, okay, well, if that's going to be the case, this document has to be able to change as time changes. All right. Now we have the Bill of Rights, which is right here. We have the freedom of religion, freedom of speech, press, assembly, and petition, right to bear arms, no quartering soldiers. So let's just quickly go through what each one of these is. So the first one, freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. This means that you have the right to follow whatever religion you want. You have the right to say whatever you want within reason, and I'll talk about that. You have the right to press, so the right for reporters to report the actual news. Assembly and petition, meaning you can gather in large groups and you can kind of picket and I guess picketing is not the right word, but you can protest things. So when we're talking about freedom of speech, it's kind of limited. I want you guys to know that. You cannot yell fire in a crowded room. You can't walk into a classroom and scream, "There's a fire," as a joke, because that's not legal. You could hurt a lot of people. So freedom of speech is kind of limited in that way. You can't just say whatever you want. You can't, lie about people. You can't do all of that stuff because that's not really your freedom of speech. Right to bear arms. You have the right to a weapon. When they had kings, they didn't have that right, but in the United States, you do. So you have the right to do that, and that was to protect the people against if the president decided to use the military to hurt us. That was why we had the right to bear arms. No quartering of soldiers. That's not about money. It means you don't have to let a soldier sleep in your house unless you want them to. So back in the day, the king might have said, "There's a war, so that means that the soldier is sleeping in your bed and you have to sleep on the floor." We don't have to do that anymore. If you don't want a soldier in your house, you don't have to have him in your house. Um, Freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures. That just means that nobody can walk into your home and say, "I'm searching your house," unless they have a reason to. They can't just walk in and say, "I'm going to search your bedroom and look for things." If you don't have a reason to do it, it's not allowed. Basically, if they think that you did something illegal, like you kidnapped someone, you're hiding them in your house somewhere, that's when they have the right to do it. But if they don't have that thought and they just want to search around, they can't. No self-incrimination and double jeopardy. You can't go into a court, and if they think you did something bad, and they decide that you didn't, they can't call you back for the same thing. That's what double jeopardy means. Um, and due process is you get a trial. You don't just get thrown in jail because they think you should be thrown in jail. You have the right to all of those things. Public trial, meaning that, and also speedy. This one's important. They can't keep you in jail for not doing something for 10 years and then do the trial. They have to do it in about one day. It's quick. And the public trial means that the public knows about it. Trial by jury means that there are people who decide. It's not just one judge. The judge asks a group of people and they vote on whether or not they think you're guilty. It's not just the judge that decides. Cruel and unusual punishments, they can't, I don't know, decide that instead of sending you to jail, they're going to hang you upside down from a tree for the rest of your life. It's not allowed. It's weird and it's cruel and it's unusual. And there's power to the states, and any of these rights retained by the people that weren't listed, they cannot be denied. So, you have the right to eat lunch whenever you want. You have the right to eat dinner whenever you want. There's no set time. You can't be punished for doing those things. So silly little things that they didn't include, they can't take away from you. Because there's a lot of things they didn't include. These are only 10 rights. You have plenty more rights than that. Next slide. The three branches of government, we already went over this. Remember, this is a total review. You have the judicial, that's the courts and judges. You have the legislative, that's the House and Senate. And you have the executive, which is the president, the cabinet, the vice president. And they work together. And remember, there's something called checks and balances. So everyone thinks that the president is the most powerful person, but he's not because he's checked by these two people. He can't decide that there's a new law, or he can't decide that someone is guilty when they're not. He needs these people to check him to make sure he doesn't become a king by accident. They don't want him having too much power. And it's the same for the courts. The courts can't make up laws and decide that they work and everyone will follow them. They need these people to say, hey, wait a minute, I don't really like that law, because any one of them can decide on something. They can declare war. They could decide tomorrow that they want to go to war with Italy. Well, the other two would say, but why? Well, if one guy in here doesn't like Italy, it's going to be a problem because there's no reason for it. So the other two can veto. That means that they can say, no, I don't think that that's the right thing. So we're going to say absolutely not. And it's essentially a vote between the three. And if all three say that it's, if two of them say, hey, we can't do this, they're checking the other one. That's how we balance the power and make sure we don't get a king from any one of these. All right. So now we're going to talk about freedom of press. See right here, we have the freedom of press. I didn't really go too far into that, but essentially it means, and this is now not a review, this is new information. Essentially it means we can report the news. Now, when there was a king, let's say the king did something bad. Let's say the king walked into a town and arrested everybody because he didn't like what they were wearing. He was allowed to do that. He's the king. He can do whatever he wants. The press would only report the good stuff. So the press would say, we have a great king. Now remember, he just arrested a whole bunch of people because, I don't know, he doesn't like the color green and they're wearing the color green. The press would say that the king is doing a great job and, he arrested those people and they probably deserved it. And he's just fantastic. Well, he's not fantastic. He just arrested a whole bunch of people for no reason. So the press was not allowed to report the news. They were only allowed to report the good things. Well, right now, we don't have to report only the good things in the United States. We can report the bad things too, because life is good and bad. And we're allowed to talk about the bad things. And the president can make good decisions and bad decisions, or decisions that we agree with and decisions that we don't. And we're allowed to report both. And we're allowed to say, this is a terrible decision. And believe it or not, this is not the case for all the countries in the world right now. Some countries still don't have this freedom. Libel is, or libel, I'm not sure, I always say it wrong, but this is writing or saying something that's not true about a person, and it can ruin their reputation. So if I say, I don't know, what's a good one that we can use in school? Let's say you're walking around and you see a girl that you don't particularly like or a boy that you don't particularly like, and you say, "Oh, they're really mean. I heard that they push teachers over and they try and push them down the stairs." Something like that. Something really, really crazy. That can ruin their reputation. Teachers and other kids will be afraid of that person. And especially if it's not true. You can't just say things that are not true. So we're not saying that press can say things that are not true. That's libel and it's not allowed. It's not part of your freedom of speech. It can make people very upset. We're saying that they can report the true news. So they're not allowed to just say whatever they want. They have to make sure that the news is correct and they have stuff to back it. And you should do the same. You shouldn't just try and ruin people's reputations. Well, this guy, Peter Zenger, was almost arrested and tried for this, meaning he was put in court for this. He reported that he didn't like this governor, and he said he was doing a bad job. And guess what? The truth was that he was doing a bad job. But a lot of people said, hey, I don't agree with that, and I think it's libel. Well, Peter Zenger printed his opinion, but his opinion had backing. So he said the governor is a bad person. And if you asked him why, he listed examples. He did this, he did this, he did this, he did this, he did this. So it's not libel. He had reasons. But people didn't agree with him and he was taken to court. Now, he actually won the case. And he is the reason the court decided, hey, he was being truthful. The governor might not be doing a great job. And he was the reason that we have freedom of press. They said, hey, he can have an opinion if he can back it, and he's backing it. So we can't arrest him for saying the wrong thing, or we can't arrest him for saying that he doesn't like this guy because he has the right to. So the jury, which is the group of people, let's say it's 12 people, voted. And essentially the jury said, yep, nope, he's fine. He didn't do anything wrong, and he won. And that's kind of why we have freedom of press right now. Otherwise, we might not have it. So we have Peter Zenger to thank. Now, after freedom of press, we also have another right. And we're going over some of our rights as citizens of this country. We have the right to vote. Same thing that the jury just did. The jury all voted. They said, hey guys, who thinks he's guilty? And maybe 3 people or 4 people raised their hands. And they said, who think he's not guilty? He didn't do anything wrong. And let's say the rest of the people, so 12 minus 3, so 9. 9 people raised their hand and said, I don't think he's wrong. Majority wins. So 9 people said he doesn't think he's wrong. 3 people said he is wrong. The 3 people, doesn't matter. All 9 people said no, and he gets to go free. Now, we vote a little differently today. So first of all, you need to be 18 years old, right? You can't just vote when you're 6 because you don't really know how to read yet. So you can't really read what these people stand for, nor do you really understand what they stand for. So you need to be an adult. You need to be 18. You have to have lived, and this is for our state, in New York for 30 days. So somebody from California can't walk in on election day and vote for somebody because they don't live here. So why would they be allowed to do that? If you don't live here and the things that the people are saying don't apply to you, so the governor of New York doesn't tell California what to do, he tells New York what to do. So people from California can't just walk in and vote for the governor of New York and leave because what he says doesn't apply to California. He doesn't control California, so they shouldn't be allowed to. So you need to live for 30 days in New York. And you need to be a citizen of the United States. So somebody who lives in Italy and who's a citizen of Italy can't walk in and vote for the president of the United States. Because again, what the president does in the United States doesn't really affect Italy. So they shouldn't be allowed to vote here. That was their thinking with these 3 rules. And they make sense. But these 3 rules were not always the same 3 rules. Some of the rules that they made for voting didn't make sense. Now, when voting first started, that's when we became America. So we separated from England and we started to vote. We said we have to make a president and we have to make sure that everyone or the majority of people agree on who it should be. It can't be a king. Only white men who were 21 were allowed to vote. Now that's 3 things that were not on our first list. Our first list said 18. In the past, it was 21. They thought that that was an adult. Now, that's not really a big deal, but this one is. Only white men. So if you were anything aside from white and a man, you weren't allowed to vote. That means that women, which is 50% or half of the population, weren't allowed to vote. And white people did not constitute most of the population. So people who were, at the time we had learned, slaves or black were not allowed to vote. So they changed this law. So in 1870, and remember, our country was made in 1776, so that's 100 years of voting later. Women still can't vote, but now people of any race can. So we started the country and only white men could vote who were 21. 100 years later, we said, okay, well, now I guess any race can vote, except for Native Americans and women. Women still were not allowed to vote. So this didn't mean that now anyone who was black or Spanish or, let's say, Asian could vote, right? Because in a lot of places, white people were still the only, white men, because women still weren't, were the only people allowed to vote because they would block other people from the voting booth. They would make a chain of people around the voting booth and they would threaten to hurt them if they told anyone about it. So they were threatening people who should have been allowed to vote so that they wouldn't, so that they would be afraid to go to the voting booths probably because they didn't want them to vote because they were afraid that they, wouldn't have the same opinion as them. So That's what they did. So even though 100 years later any race can vote, they still actually couldn't because they were blocked from the booths. They were told they weren't allowed to go by regular people, not by the government, but by regular everyday people. And Native Americans still were not allowed to vote because they still weren't considered citizens, even though they were technically here first. What about women, though? 1920, women were given the right to vote. So that's basically 200 years later, women were given the right to vote. But they had to fight for it. And the women who protested were called suffragettes, not because they're suffering, but that's what they called themselves, suffrage. They wanted the right to vote. They wanted that equal right. They held rallies and protests to gain their right, and not everyone agreed with them. In fact, a lot of women had husbands who disagreed with them, and they had to go home to them and hear that they shouldn't be allowed to vote. But in 1920, they gained that right. So over 100 years later, not quite 200, but women were then allowed to vote. And in 1964, everyone, no matter their race, can vote. And 1 year later, there's no longer a literacy test. So let's talk about that. So 1964, it was made completely illegal, and you could be arrested for blocking the voting booths. 1964, they said to themselves, if you're blocking the voting booths and you're not letting women, people who have a different pigment on their skin, so people who are not white, let's say people who are black, people who are Spanish, people who are Native American, you are doing something illegal and you will go to jail. Fantastic. But a year after this, there's no longer a literacy test. What's a literacy test? It means that you had to pass a test that said you could read at a certain level in order to vote. Now, is that fair? No, because not everybody reads at the same level. And that's okay. And also, if you don't read at that level in English, they told you couldn't vote. So you could read at a really high level in, let's say, Spanish, but that didn't count. They wanted you to be able to read in English. A year after 1964, so in 1965, they said, hey, I don't really think the literacy test should be allowed because some people can't read very well, but that doesn't make them any less smart or able to vote. And I agree with that. I don't think that there should be a literacy test, and that's why there is none anymore. People said, hey, I don't think this is right, and so they got rid of it. Thank goodness. So a lot of you are probably asking the question, why only white men? Why were they the only people allowed to vote? Why just men in general, and why just white in general? To be honest, the people of the past weren't very kind, and they weren't very smart, to be very honest. They just weren't perfect. They still had a lot to learn about people. So they thought that some people were better than others. They thought men in general were better than women, and then they thought white people in general were better than everyone else. And we're still not perfect today, but we've come a long way. And in the beginning, when America was first created, there were slaves. And they didn't believe that slaves were people. They thought they owned them, that they were property, so they weren't allowed to vote. But just because slavery ended in 1865, that doesn't mean that everyone became equal in 1865, because a lot of people still had hatred for slaves, and they hated the fact that they were free. And a lot of places, even after people were told that they were equal, still weren't equal for a very long time because people held a lot of hatred. And that's something that we should not have today because we know better. We know a lot better than to have hatred for people based on the color of their skin. So our goal is to become better and better and move past what the people who first created this country thought. And not everyone thought it, but a lot of people did. And that is our voting system. That's what we spoke about today, just voting, and we did a quick review. And now you know that voting is very different today because everyone who's a citizen is allowed to vote, except for the state votes. You have to live in the state for 30 days, but you're still allowed to vote in your own state. So we learned that and how different it was between men, women, and people who were not white. And that is all. And remember, use your voting rights. They're very important. And by the way, for the people who were not able to watch the video essentially said that the reason we vote is so that things that we agree with get passed and things that we don't agree with don't get passed. So if you don't vote, you're essentially saying, I don't care, which you should care. There are a lot of things that you should vote for. You should vote for president. You should care who runs our country. You should vote for the governor. You should vote for anyone who they ask you to vote for, you should put a vote in because you should probably care about who is running all of the things that our country has. And another reason you should vote is because it's one of your rights as a citizen, and not many other places have those rights. So you should always exercise the rights that you have, especially if you can. Now, you guys are not 18, so you can't vote. But when you become 18, you are encouraged to do that. And that is all. I'll see you guys later.